impressed with the turnout. You know, when I was invited by the New Mexico Wildlife Federation to come out on a Wednesday evening and spend a couple hours talking wilderness, I thought like maybe my mom and wife would show up, which they did, which is awesome. But the fact that they're like trying to figure out where to get more chairs in here is a testament to really the legacy of the Southwest and New Mexico in particular, in terms of being a place where people and wild places and wild animals have a very deep and rich history. And I'm guessing, based on the fact that you chose of your own volition to spend your Wednesday night at a venue like this, at a talk like this, that you're part of that legacy. So it's a pretty cool honor. And on the way over here, I was thinking back to being in like middle school and high school, and everybody asks you what you want to be when you grow up. And if you would have told me at the time that there would be an opportunity to spend Wednesday evenings at micro brew pubs talking wilderness and wildlife with a bunch of people who appreciate those things, who are part of that tribe that I affiliate with, I would have said, man, I want to do that. At the time, I didn't know that existed, so I feel pretty lucky. Thanks, man. This picture is about a week old, and my wife sitting here took this photo down in the Gila, and I'm still at the point right now, you know, a lot of times I think about internal combustion with disdain. You know, I recognize climate change as a big, like, existential threat to everything that we hold dear, including ourselves. But man, after putting on a bunch of miles in the Gila, being able to sit down in a leather chair and step on a pedal that propels you down the road without any real investment of musculature is something pretty special. So what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about the recent family trip I had down in the Gila. I do want to get a little educational with y'all. How many of you would say you know what wilderness is about? Like if you were asked on the street, you'd be able to give a spiel about what wilderness really is. Okay, so maybe like a little less than half. So by the time we walk out of here, I want everybody to be like, you know, I could give a little wilderness 101 to somebody. Because not every wild place is truly wilderness. We're going to talk about that. And then I want to leave you with some resources that you can use to capitalize fully, not just on the wildernesses of New Mexico, but the wildernesses of the whole National Wilderness Preservation System. And I also want to get a little philosophical, because this morning on my drive into work, you know, I'm super unimpressed with the quality of news in general, like how partisan a lot of the news outlets are in America. So what I've done, like the one reason I pay for satellite radio is so I can listen to the BBC News. It's like all I listen to when I'm on my commute daily. And so this morning on my drive into work, you know, I was thinking about this presentation while listening to the BBC News. And I think it was because I was in my wilderness mindset that this series of stories that I heard on the BBC, they kind of struck a chord with me. So I want to leave you with some philosophical observations from my time listening to the BBC this morning. So for starters, how many of y'all did something similar to this spring? How many of you got out chasing the wily wild turkey? Okay, about half. And keep your hand up if you filled a tag. Nice. Okay, got some turkey whisperers. How about filling a tag in wilderness? Anybody got some wilderness gobbler slayers? All right, that's good. That's good. Well, if you're interested next spring, go ahead and get out your pens and jot down the GPS coordinates of where I was hunting. Okay, next slide. All right, so one of my favorite strategies. Can you guys see this? It's kind of bright up front. I don't know if we got a switch. We can dim the lights a little bit. So this is a selfie. I don't take a lot of selfies, but I wanted to send a picture to my buddy back in Wisconsin to show him on the first night of turkey season that I was in fact bivvy camping, which is a fancy way of saying laying on the ground within earshot of a roosted gobbler. Okay, and one of my favorite ways to hunt turkeys is to be out there like the day before, either hooting or crow calling or hen yelping or gobbling, trying to figure out where roosted birds are. And then real quietly when it gets dark, just kind of sneak in there, lay out my sleeping bag, and just zonk out, knowing that when I wake up in the morning, I'm within earshot of a roosted gobbler. It gives me like a sense of confidence. Unfortunately, on this particular night when I woke up, there were like 40-mile-an-hour winds. That's the one thing about hunting turkeys in New Mexico in the spring. The winds can just be brutal. And I never heard this bird gobble in the morning. But this is the kind of thing that ever since I've been, a kid, I've enjoyed these adventures. And I hope I don't grow out of it. I think at times, my lady's like, you're out laying on the ground and you could be at home, snuggling up with the family. But this is a pretty fresh picture. And I'm going to tell you this is in the Manzano Mountains, which is right outside of Albuquerque, okay? And I don't feel like I'm sharing a super gem area with you because, first of all, it's like a nice big chunk of country. But second of all, every year since I started hunting the Manzanos in 2015, I feel like the quality of turkey hunting there has gone down. And I think it's being driven by drought. So I'm hoping that this year with the good snowpack we had, the good precip we got over the winter, that those birds start to rebound. But I kept track because I kind of, dork out on wildlife like you might expect. And I saw 4.5 times as many of these as I did turkeys during my time hunting in the Manzano. So it's staying like really solid horned lizard or horny toad habitat, if you prefer. But the turkey numbers have been on the decline. So I decided to flee from this mountain range. And I'd always wanted to get out and try turkey hunting on the west side of the Santa Fe. I'd never been up there. And there's this great big chunk of wilderness up there called San Pedro Parks. So I went up there, and I left home at like 2 o'clock in the morning, drove up there, got there before daylight, started hiking, and I was post-holing in like 3 feet of snow mid-season up there. So I went from baking in the Manzanos to trudging in thigh-deep snow, but I did cross paths with a nice fresh set of bear tracks up there. That's my report from San Pedro Parks, and did not cut a single set of turkey tracks. So then the family and I gathered up and we retreated down to the Gila and Aldo Leopold country. And this was a cool trip because I had a chance to take my brother-in-law, who's a new adult onset hunter, and his fiancée, Sarah, who's like totally green at hunting. And one of the reasons I put this picture in here, besides them being like photogenic and cute couple, that tree in the background, check out this juniper. That's them standing down at the bottom of this juniper. It's like one of the coolest juniper trees. And so that's back in the Gila a few miles, and I've visited that tree a number of times, and I like thinking about the fact that that tree predates like any concept of history that I'm familiar with. I don't know how old that tree is, but it's certainly much older than our country, much older than the Gila, much older than the Wilderness Act, and it'll be there after everybody in this room is long dead and gone, I hope. So we're down in the Gila, and my future sister-in-law, who's never hunted anything before, she decided she really wants to be familiar with where her food comes from, and if she's going to eat meat, she feels like she should be comfortable shooting a turkey. And so she'd been wrestling with this for a few years and finally decided she wanted to go for it. And we had a couple phone calls before the hunt, and I'm talking to her on the phone, and she's saying, I think I want to come down there and shoot a turkey. I'm ready to shoot a turkey. And I'm trying to explain to her, it's not like you just go out and a turkey presents itself and you shoot it. That's not the way this works. As many folks I've hunted with will attest, you can put on a lot of miles and not kill a turkey. In the first couple days, she and my brother-in-law were wandering around with a box call, hearing some birds on the roost, but not having any close calls. And a few days into the hunt, I went out with them, and we went into this drainage a few miles back in the wilderness. And there was this bird roosted in the exact same spot where the past 2 years there had been a gobbler roosted. In the last 2 years, my wife Shoshana and I had gone in there, and we'd set up down at the bottom of this slope along a creek drainage and tried to call that bird off the roost into this beautiful meadow that seemed like the perfect place for a turkey to strut and gobble at sunrise. And every time, the last 2 years, that bird would come off the roost and go up on the ridgetop and strut and gobble along the ridgetop. And so this year I heard that bird there, and I'm thinking back to these last 2 hunts where we put on miles just following this turkey into the hinterlands as he would gobble back at us but never stop walking away from us. And we climbed up this steep ridge and got around on the opposite side of that roost. And before we even called, as we were climbing up the ridge, I saw the top of this gobbler's fan over the horizon, like the near horizon, facing towards us. And he was slowly strutting his way on the ridge in exactly the direction we were set up. So I'm not positive this was exactly the same bird, but it was doing exactly what this turkey had done the last 2 years that we had not been able to get close to. And so it was like made for a turkey hunting setup. There's this beautiful little rock right at the right height for Sarah to lean over with her shotgun. There was a great log for my brother-in-law to hide behind where he could see everything that was going on. And I was able to stick the decoy out and just kind of hunker down behind the decoy. And I yelped softly 3 times with a diaphragm call. Turkey gobbled instantly, and then spent about 10 minutes covering 75 yards in full strut, drumming and spitting. And these are noises where if you've never turkey hunted, if you've never been close to a wild turkey in the spring, it's like the craziest noises you can imagine. They're fanned out. It's like they're flexing all their muscles so hard, fanning out their feathers, it makes this vibration sound. And they do this little vocalization, so they make this boom. And that bird's coming towards us, and I know that at some point Sarah's going to be able to see this turkey. And so I slowly turn to where I can get a glimpse of her, and as I'm turning my head, the first thing I see is her shotgun barrel. And her shotgun barrel is just like violently shaking. And this turkey finally gets into about 15 yards, full strut, going back and forth, dialed in on the decoy that I'm laying behind. And I'm thinking, maybe she got cold feet. Maybe she decided she doesn't want to shoot a turkey. Boom! Turkey goes down. And look at this smile on this lady. So that's her Thanksgiving dinner. So future sister-in-law in the backcountry, okay? And she and my brother-in-law, these are like some pretty, they're not avid hunters by any means, obviously, but they're badass outdoors people. Like they're big into bouldering and rock climbing. They both have, you know, like 2% body fat. They're scampering around on all these cliff faces that I don't have any interest in being anywhere near. But I thought, man, this would be a good opportunity to see what they can do in terms of hiking some miles. So we started getting into some like pretty rugged, you know, start at the trailhead at 2, hike till 5:30, listen for gobblers in all these new places. And just to kind of add a little fun twist to it, I told him I had a SteriPen for water, which is true. You guys know what a SteriPen is? Anybody use those? It's like a UV light that you can use. You stir it in your Nalgene, and it makes creek water so you can drink it without having like IBS the rest of your life. And I did have a SteriPen, and I didn't realize at the time that I was joking with him. The problem was like the power button had been smashed. So we got back in there about 6.5, 7 miles, and we go to refill all of our Camelbacks, and the thing doesn't have any batteries anymore. So you're faced with this conundrum. Do you drink the creek water and end up, like I said, with lifetime IBS potentially, or do you then see what you're made of and hike out 7 miles till you're delirious with dehydration? But on the way, of course, we bumped into a randy gobbler, and here's their selfie on the way out, and my enthusiasm of this turkey we managed to ambush. So we've got Thanksgiving for the brother-in-law and his future wife. We've got Thanksgiving for me and my family. And again, if y'all are interested, go ahead and jot these coordinates down. All right. The other thing we did a lot of, I like to talk about raising a semi-feral human. And I'm a fan of like dirt on the face and scraped knees and cut feet, as long as it's accompanied with a smile. And the last few years we've gone to the same place, camped as a family, and tried to indoctrinate this little one here into the finer things in life that don't involve electricity. And one of the reasons I wanted to put her picture up there, aside from the fact that I'm very partial to her, is because she actually, in some ways, owes her very existence to the 1964 Wilderness Act. Among the parcels of land that were designated by Congress in 1964 when the Wilderness Act was passed is the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. Anybody familiar? Boundary Waters? So I'll talk a little bit about the statistics of, you know, how much wilderness there was initially, how much there is now, and so on. But back when I was courting this lovely lady, we took a couple canoe trips up there. So here's the younger versions of ourselves, slaying some walleye and some smallmouth bass and camping in a tent. And it was up there, you know, I had this girlfriend at the time that I was fond of, but it was portaging these like multi-mile portages with all this gear and having your hands completely compromised by needing to hold the gunnels of a canoe while mosquitoes are just like eating your soul and she's still smiling, you know? I was like, I might need to marry this girl. And so without the Wilderness Act, it's possible that you would not exist, my dear. And in fact, if we rewind to a couple turkey camps ago, Turkey Camp 2014, Lincoln National Forest, Wilderness. I won't go any farther than that in terms of specifics. But Clara was there as well, stumbling around over these hills. My wife did think she was going to need to be evacuated by helicopter at one point in these hikes. So Clara was there collecting sheds, filling up our packs. And at our most recent turkey camp, no, she's not going to the bathroom. I promise I wouldn't put a picture like that up there. This is her taking pictures. She's like she's a photo bug with the next member of the family in utero at Turkey Camp 2019. So trying like from pre-birth to indoctrinate members of our family into all things wilderness. Okay. So I want to rewind just a little bit and talk about my roots. So I'm a kid from the northwest lower peninsula of Michigan. I grew up outside of Traverse City. Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes was like my backyard basically growing up. And as a brief aside, in 2014, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, a lot of the area I like to stomp around in was designated as a part of the National Wilderness Preservation System as the Sleeping Bear Dunes Wilderness. And so I had a lot of time wandering around without adult contribution or interference. And if not for those experiences, I would not be doing the work I'm doing today. And given that we're here on the week of Mother's Day, just a quick little tale. You guys know what bird this is? Bonus points? Ah, American woodcock. I've heard it a couple times, I think. When I was expressing a lot of interest in wildlife and nature, and at that kind of awkward teenage age where you don't really want to be around your mom a whole lot, my mom was really looking for opportunities to bond with me. And these woodcock in the spring, they do this Skydance, this mating display, where they fly up real high. And actually the hummingbirds here do the same thing. They fly up real high, make all kinds of noise, and then the hummingbirds will dive bomb back down, but the woodcock will like circle back down and make this chortly sort of noise, and then land in almost the same spot from where they took off. And they'll strut and they'll peent. They make this like meeh, meeh sound. And the cool thing is, if you figure out where they're taking off from and you lay down in that spot, it's almost like they'll land on your chest trying to come back to strut. And so my mom came out with me and laid under the camouflage blanket to observe this woodcock display. And it's just an example of like throughout those years growing up, all the many little things that my parents did to encourage what E.O. Wilson calls biophilia, right? Our innate fascination with the natural world. So for all of you who have a chance to influence kids in such a way, or maybe in the future will have a chance to do that, seize those opportunities like my mom did. But the stream behind our house was the thing that really made life great. And I'm not going to give you coordinates for this stream. But it was loaded with brook trout, and it had some brown trout in it too. And as like a budding conservationist, I would always eat the brown trout, you know, the German invading brown trout, and then treat the brook trout like they were, you know, magical, pure gold. Now that I live in the West, it's like slay the brook trout, slay the brown trout, love the cutthroat, love the Gila trout. But I would eat these browns, and my brother and I had a cast iron skillet, and I think we might have pilfered it from you. I apologize if that's the case. Kind of tinged with rust. And we kept this skillet wrapped up in a black plastic garbage bag under a log pile back by the stream. And we would go off on these jaunts with a backpack that had a little bit of olive oil, knives, of course. Got to have like 3 knives each at least. Sometimes we'd have our .22 rifle, and we would fish. We would look for mushrooms, you know, morel mushrooms, beefsteak mushrooms, and we would hunt small game, grouse, rabbits, squirrels, and then we'd cook stuff over the open fire. And some of those meals were rugged. Like you'd bite into the crispy exoskeleton of a charred squirrel, and then your teeth would get into the like cold, sinewy, raw inner core. And we'd be like, oh, we're men, you know, we got like our peach fuzz mustaches going. Like, I'm Davy Crockett playing these games, right? And my brother, by the way, has now worked developing environmental ed curricula up in the Pacific Northwest. So coincidence, I think not. But anyway, this is one of my most precious spots, and I thought of it as wilderness at the time, before I really knew what wilderness was. And when I got to my undergrad degree program at the University of Michigan, one spring, when turkeys were just really starting to kind of recover in the northwest lower peninsula of Michigan, I drew a limited entry turkey license for this area. And I started hatching this plan where I was going to go up to my native home range and try to hunt a spring turkey, try to find some morel mushrooms, and undoubtedly catch some brook trout and brown trout. And I also wanted to see if I could find that skillet, because I had plans of like recovering the skillet and having it for an artifact for the rest of my existence. And when I was a kid, and you could attest to this, I had a plat book. You guys know what a plat book is? Like from the county, where it shows the ownership of the whole county in hard copy format. And you could look up in the phone book. God, I'm starting to sound old, man. I'm glad there's people in here with like more gray hair, less hair, all that here, because I'm starting to feel old just telling this story. But the plat book, you could figure out who owned those little pieces that you're always trespassing on and really wanted to have like legitimate access to. And so I started printing off copies of the plat book and tacking them up on my bedroom wall, and then taking a highlighter to draw highlight lines around every property that I got permission to recreate on. And this was primarily small game hunting and fishing, but also camping, just like kind of general exploring. And if I could pay like $1,000 right now to have those pages just back, I would do that. I don't know where they are now, but by the time I graduated from high school, my wall in my bedroom, it looked kind of like a national forest with a few inholdings where I didn't have permission. But I could pretty much wander wherever I wanted to and had legit access. So I kind of took for granted that through mending fences and taking care of livestock and baling a ton of hay, I could go pretty much wherever I wanted and consider that permission still granted. And when I went on my way back to that spot, the 2-track that we used to use to kind of get down to the stream in the 3 or 4 years since I'd been there last suddenly had been paved. I was like, this does not bode well. So rather than walking down a 2-track, I was walking down like a paved, semi-private road. And when I got to the end of it, this is what had popped up in the few years since I'd been away at school, where morel mushrooms had previously done the popping. And in the backyard of the house on the left, that is where I took the first shot I ever took at a white-tailed deer. And for folks who don't hunt, this isn't going to mean anything, but for folks who do, it'll mean something. I was shooting a 12-gauge shotgun with slugs with a smoothbore barrel and a bead to aim with. So the chances of actually hitting the deer were slim, and that panned out to be, in fact, what happened. But I have it vividly, like I can remember the picture in my mind of the bead and the deer and everything that was there, the trees. And when I went back and started sneaking around to see the full extent of the damage of this development, the place where that deer had been standing had a damn trampoline, like right where the deer had been. And I thought to myself, this is a new feeling. This is the first time I had the experience of losing a place that I loved. And I went through a stage, and I don't think I'm fully done with this stage, of grieving the loss of a particular place. So this area, this chunk of ground that I had thought of as being wilderness in my uneducated knowledge of what wilderness really was, this was like my wild place, had been, I don't think, if you ask the owners, this is too strong of a word, the owners of the property and the house, but like desecrated is the word that comes to my mind, right? From my standpoint as a, say, 13 to 20-year-old boy / young man, it felt desecrated. And that was the first little hint that I got that not all lands are created equal. So is anybody, let me see a show of hands of folks who have felt the loss of a personal wild place that has mattered to them. Like, show of hands. Half the room? Okay. So imagine how the response to that question might differ if you were to poll a room full of people in Shanghai or Mumbai or Beijing. How many of them had lost a special wild natural place that helped shape who they are? Because for me, I feel like I am a better person. I have a better relationship with my sibling. I have a better relationship with my whole family as a result of spending time in places that allowed me to commune in a way with the natural world. And it's easy, I think, especially in a place like New Mexico, for us to think that that's normal, to have those opportunities. It's really easy for us to take for granted that you just have access to wild places, to wildlife. And it's important, I think, to recognize that in 2019, if you were to look at the global population and consider what proportion of our fellow human beings alive today have any kind of access to any kind of natural beauty, it is a small minority, right? And that's one of the things, in my opinion, that makes being an American, that makes living in this country, makes living in a state like New Mexico a point of supreme fortune. Like, every person who raised their hand and has at least had a chance to be shaped by a place, even if it was taken away, that's something you carry with you the rest of your life, and I think it makes you better, and I think it makes you extremely fortunate. So before going to China, this was kind of my image of what it would be like in Southeast Asia. And when I got a chance to spend time over there doing my research as a graduate student, I saw some of this, but I also had a chance to experience places like this. This is Juzhaigo Nature Reserve in Yunnan Province. And in this nature reserve, there are streams with trout. There are artesian wells where you can drink the water from the ground. If you spook an ungulate, unlike where I grew up when you knew it was a white-tailed deer, because that's the only thing there, you had to try to figure out which of 7 ungulates you had just kicked up. The biodiversity is incredible. It's a place where you can walk down a 2-track and flush golden pheasants and ringneck pheasants back to back. It's a natural paradise. And I had a chance to go there and do my research because I had research permits issued by the Chinese government. And some of the places where I did my research in China, if you didn't have a permit, you couldn't go there, whether you were a member of the Chinese citizenry or an international guest. They were established for the protection of wildlife, but closed to the public. And so another point that I think we often take for granted with our public land system here in America is the fact that it's available for multiple uses, which can be a real sticky pain in the butt as a land manager at times. But the opportunity to go out and recreate and just, operate as though these places belong to you, because they do, that is unique. And not every country that has, a de facto federally administered public land system has that. So in contrast to needing a research preserve permit to do my PhD research, if I want to go to Cruces Basin and slay a bunch of non-native brook trout, I don't have to ask anybody's permission. I just show up and do it. And so experiences like this is what brought me to New Mexico. And if you look at the way people with means are starting to shift their distribution around the face of the American map, look at the places that are bustling and booming and the things that make people choose to live in particular geographies, access to these public lands is a big deal. There's a reason the Front Range has exploded. There's a reason Bozeman, Montana is blowing up. There's a reason Santa Fe is one of the fastest growing small towns in America. And that proximity to public lands, I think, is a testament to how precious these resources are. And being here in Albuquerque, the fact that we have a wilderness area that everybody can look at every day, and just kind of be like, oh yeah, there's the Sandias. Like you start getting in this mode of just taking it totally for granted. And that's why Albuquerque is a cool place to do a Wilderness 101 workshop. And although it kind of compromises the wilderness vibe, the view from the south peak of the Sandias at dusk is pretty cool. So I want to dive in and just give you a little history leading up to the passage of the Wilderness Act. And when I think about the culture of America developing towards the wilderness ideals, it's important to remember, we were initially facing this westward expansion driven by commodity extraction. And the fur trade is one good example of that, the bison hunters, people being drawn west into these wild, remote, unexplored, uninhabited, although they, of course, were inhabited, landscapes. And so wilderness in this time frame was something to be conquered, something to be dominated. And in a lot of ways, that rugged individualism that propelled people west has become one element of our American identity. And I don't want it to be lost on any of us in this conversation, of course, that many of these places that were seen as unoccupied, undeveloped, in need of domination were, of course, occupied by people who had lived here for untold millennia and who had deep connections to these places. And as our technology improved and our ability to dominate these landscapes improved, it started to raise alarm bells in the minds of some. So we started, we got the Transcontinental Railroad. We started being able to move livestock across the whole continent. We started fencing the range. And this, in part, is what led some of our conservation icons, like TR, to work towards the establishment of our national forest system, to start setting aside some places so that they could be managed in perpetuity for the American people, so it wouldn't all be dominated. And again, this idea of rugged individualism, you think about the Rough Riders, TR's history in Cuba, running up San Juan Hill with a pistol. Like, these are the stories that, legends are made of, and at the heart of it is this notion that we have a rugged, can-do identity as American people. But we started taming our landscapes more and more. And at the beginning of the 1900s, the West was becoming more and more populated. Roads were being put in all over the place where there hadn't historically been roads. And we were starting to lose species. So the extinction, for example, of the passenger pigeon was a wake-up call. Certainly for Leopold, this was one of the things he pointed to as a stark reminder of our increasing dominance and compromising of wildness in America. And our dependence upon the automobile has changed the way we distribute ourselves around the land, changed our relationships. And so I want to point out a couple of the big thinkers of this era who had an influence on the wilderness ideal. One is Arthur Carhartt, who was the first recreation professional ever to work for the Forest Service. And in 1920, he pushed for the recommendation that a place called Trapper Lake up in Colorado near the White River be set aside and not developed with a bunch of infrastructure. And he said, there is a limit to the number of lands of shoreline on the lakes. There's a limit to the number of lakes in existence. There is a limit to the mountainous areas of the world. And there are portions of natural scenic beauty which are God-made and which of a right should be the property of all people. So he didn't want these precious shoreline properties to be developed, to be privatized. And if you go up there now, has anybody been to Trapper Lake? It's available for fantastic fishing, very undeveloped shoreline. But at that point in time, where the idea that more infrastructure was progress, the notion that you would just set aside a particular chunk of national forest and try to retain it in some sort of undeveloped state, and that was better, was seen as kind of a lunatic idea. I want to point 1920 as the date, because it was just a few years later that we had this young man, Aldo Leopold, pushing for the first administratively designated wild area on the Gila National Forest at the headwaters of the Gila River. And I hesitate to ask this question, but show of hands, who's read a Sand County Almanac? Okay, most folks. If you haven't read a Sand County Almanac, that's your homework assignment for the day. So many phenomenal quotable quotes. Leopold was a brilliant philosopher, conservationist, and writer. So here's one of the quotes from the Sand County Almanac. Man always kills the thing he loves. And so we, the pioneers, have killed our wilderness. Some say we had to. Be that as it may, I am glad I shall never be young without wild country to be young in. And I think there's a little bit of hyperbole here, because the reality is, in no small part due to Leopold's contribution, we haven't killed our wilderness. We still have at least vestiges of it. We still have 100+ million acres of designated wilderness in this country. So we all still have opportunities to be young in wild places. But we need people to be aware of that. We need people to be outspoken advocates of it. And so 1945 I'm pointing to as the publication date here. This quote is part of the Sand County Almanac. But prior to that, 1924, Leopold has written a rich collection of essays and magazine articles, the vast majority of which are not part of the Sand County Almanac. And this one particular essay, called A Plea for Wilderness Hunting Grounds, Leopold wrote for Outdoor Life magazine in 1924. And in that article, he said, wilderness is the one kind of playground which mankind cannot build to order, contrive to get the Gila headwaters withdrawn as a wilderness area, be kept as pack country, free from additional roads forever. And let me get a show of hands. How many people would like to hear a Leopold essay read now? I'm thinking about reading Escadilla, about the last grizzly killed in the Arizona-New Mexico border country. Or we can keep plowing on with the presentation. So show of hands, who wants to hear Escadilla? All right, I see the yeas have it. All right, so this will be your little taste of a Sand County Almanac. It's just a few pages, and it's beautiful. You guys know where Escadilla is? It's like right on the state line between Arizona and New Mexico. Okay. Escadilla. Life in Arizona was bounded underfoot by grama grass, overhead by sky, and on the horizon by Escadilla. To the north of the mountain you rode on honey-colored plains. Look up anywhere, anytime, and you saw Escadilla. To the east you rode over a confusion of wooded mesas. Each hollow seemed its own small world, soaked in sun, fragrant with juniper, and cozy with the chatter of pinyon jays. But top out on a ridge, and you at once became a speck in an immensity. On its edge hung Escadilla. To the south lay the tangled canyons of the Blue River, full of whitetails, wild turkeys, and wilder cattle. When you missed a saucy buck waving his goodbye over the skyline and looked down your sights to wonder why, you looked at a far blue mountain, Escadilla. To the west billowed the outliers of the Apache National Forest. We cruised timber there, converting the tall pines 40 by 40 into notebook figures, representing hypothetical lumber piles. Panting up a canyon, the cruiser felt a curious incongruity between the remoteness of his notebook symbols and the immediacy of sweaty fingers, locust thorns, deer fly bites, and scolding squirrels. But on the next ridge, a cold wind roaring across a green sea of pines blew his doubts away. On the far shore hung Escadilla. The mountain bounded not only our work and play, but even our attempts to get a good dinner. On winter evenings, we often tried to ambush a mallard on the river flats. The wary flocks circled the rosy west, the steel blue north, and then disappeared into the inky black of Escadilla. If they reappeared on set wings, we had a fat drake for the Dutch oven. If they failed to reappear, it was bacon and beans again. There was, in fact, only one place from which you did not see Escadilla on the skyline. That was the top of Escadilla itself. Up there you could not see the mountain, but you could feel it. The reason was the Big Bear. Old Bigfoot was a robber baron, and Escadilla was his castle. Each spring when the warm winds had softened the shadows of the snow, the old grizzly crawled out of his hibernation den in the rock slides and, descending the mountain, bashed in the head of a cow. Eating his fill, he climbed back to his crags, and there he summered peaceably on marmots, conies, berries, and roots. I once saw one of his kills. The cow's skull and neck were pulp, as if she had collided head-on with a fast freight. No one ever saw the old bear, but in the muddy springs about the base of the cliffs you saw his incredible tracks. Seeing them made the most hard-bitten cowboys aware of bear. Wherever they rode, they saw the mountain, and when they saw the mountain, they thought of bear. Campfire conversations ran to beef, bales, and bear. Bigfoot claimed for his own only a cow a year and a few square miles of useless rocks, but his personality pervaded the county. Those were the days when Progress first came to the cow country. Progress had various emissaries. One was the first transcontinental automobilist. The cowboys understood this breaker of roads. He talked the same breezy bravado as any breaker of broncos. They did not understand, but they listened to and looked at the pretty lady in the black velvet who came to enlighten them in a Boston accent about women's suffrage. They marveled, too, at the telephone engineer who strung wires on the junipers and brought instantaneous messages from town. An old man asked whether the wire could bring him a side of bacon. One spring, Progress sent still another emissary, a government trapper, a sort of St. George in overalls seeking dragons to slay at government expense. Were there, he asked, any destructive animals in need of slaying? Yes, there was the big bear. The trapper packed his mule and headed for Escadilla. In a month he was back, his mule staggering under a heavy hide. There was only one barn in town big enough to dry it on. He had tried traps, poison, and his usual wiles, all to no avail. Then he had erected a set gun in a defile through which only the bear could pass, and waited. The last grizzly walked into the string and shot himself. It was June. The pelt was foul, patchy, and worthless. It seemed to us rather an insult to deny the last grizzly the chance to leave a good pelt as a memorial to his race. All he left was a skull in the National Museum and a quarrel among scientists over the Latin name of the skull. It was only after we pondered on these things that we began to wonder who wrote the rules for progress. Since the beginning, time had gnawed at the basaltic hulk of Escadilla, wasting, waiting, and building. Time built three things on the old mountain: a venerable aspect, a community of minor animals and plants, and a grizzly. The government trapper who took the grizzly knew he had made Escadilla safe for cows. He did not know he had toppled the spire off an edifice, a building since the morning stars sang together. The bureau chief who sent the trapper was a biologist versed in the architecture of evolution, but he did not know that spires might be as important as cows. He did not foresee that within 2 decades the cow country would become tourist country, and as such have a greater need of bears than of beefsteaks. The congressmen who voted money to clear the ranges of bears were the sons of pioneers. They acclaimed the superior virtues of the frontiersmen, but they strove with might and main to make the end of the frontier. We forest officers who acquiesced in the extinguishment of the bear knew a local rancher who had plowed up a dagger engraved with the name of one of Coronado's captains. We spoke harshly of the Spaniards who, in their zeal for gold and converts, had needlessly extinguished the native Indians. It did not occur to us that we, too, were the captains of an invasion too sure of our own righteousness. Escadilla still hangs on the horizon, but when you see it, you no longer think of bear. It is only a mountain now. Leopold. So, in that essay, he's talking about the philosophy that underpins the whole history of the wilderness movement. The notion that in some places, having an intact ecosystem, having the full biota that evolved and existed there historically, is in fact the highest and best use of a chunk of public land. And I mentioned earlier some of the challenges, the frustrations that can come from working for an agency that has these complicated and diverse and at times at odds management objectives. You know, the Forest Service and the BLM are the two federal multiple use agencies where you feel like you're getting pulled in all these different directions. And you're oftentimes trying to figure out for a particular chunk of ground, what is the highest and best use of that chunk of ground? Should it be a campsite? Should it be a road? Should it be a timber sale? Should it be a mining sale? Should it be a grazing allotment? and to have a particular chunk of ground where we recognize as a society, with Congress signing off, that in fact the highest and best use might just be to let that place be what it's always been, is a pretty unique and beautiful thing. So another architect I want to point out, a guy by the name of Howard Zahn. I put these dates up there because I think it's important to note, can't quite see the top here, born 1906, died 1964. He died the same year the Wilderness Act passed, shortly before its passage. Zahn was the key author of the vast majority of the Wilderness Act. And in the 8 years leading up to the passage of the Wilderness Act, between 1956 and 1964, the Wilderness Act underwent 66 different rewrites. And they fielded 6,000 pages of testimony and had 19 public hearings all around the country. And one of the pieces of Zahn lore, legend, it's true, is that his wife fashioned for him a special overcoat with these extra large, deep pockets, so that when he was hustling his way around D.C. lobbying for the Wilderness Act and trying to meet with all the congressionals, he could have numerous copies tucked away so he could just pull out full copies of the Wilderness Act at these meetings. So this dude was extremely committed. And a couple of things he had to say. And again, bear in mind that his passing was before the passage of the Act. The purpose of the Wilderness Act is to preserve the wilderness character of the areas to be included in the wilderness system, not to establish any particular use. So unlike most of the things we do on our public lands where we're trying to figure out what uses constitute the highest and best use of a given piece of ground, we're not trying to do that in wilderness. We're just trying to maintain wilderness character. He also said, to know the wilderness is to know a profound humility, to recognize one's littleness, and to sense dependence and interdependence, indebtedness and responsibility. I oftentimes like to point out, when I'm in a place like the Gila starting to feel like a speck on the map, it's the same kind of feeling you get looking at the night sky. You know, whatever it is you're stressing about, you're like, man, it's not that big of a deal. Because ultimately, this whole planet doesn't even really matter all that much. So the night sky and the wilderness have some similarities in that regard. I also want to point out, so this is Leopold on the left and Olis Miri on the right. And these two gentlemen co-founded the Wilderness Society. So Leopold's got his footprints all over here today. He helped found the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, who graciously is hosting this talk. He really helped found, in a very fundamental way, the first wilderness area in 1924 with the Gila. And he helped found the Wilderness Society. So Muri, the guy on the right, is often called the father of modern elk management. He was a wildlife biologist as well. And he and his wife, Marty, were giants of conservation, also helping lobby for the passage of the Wilderness Act. This is one of my favorite presidential quotes, uttered by LBJ on the day that he signed the Wilderness Act in 1964. If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it. I'd like to know if he wrote that himself. I'd like to think that he did. And at the signing of the Wilderness Act, of course, as I mentioned, Howard Zahn was not there, but he was well represented by his wife, who had made that coat on his behalf for all that hustling around D.C. So wilderness areas are administered by all four of the federal land management agencies. And it's important to note that regardless of whether or not an agency has a multiple use mandate, like the Forest Service and BLM, or if they have a more preservation-oriented mandate, like the Park Service, or a focus on fish and wildlife conservation, none of that matters in terms of how the Wilderness Act should be interpreted and implemented. The Wilderness Act is the Wilderness Act, whether you're talking about a wilderness on BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, etc. And do folks have that hard copy of their Wilderness Act? Can we take a look at that real quick? Saddle up with your neighbor. Because, you know, this is not a political statement about liking or disliking Obamacare, but I'm bringing up Obamacare because I've seen pictures of the legislation where it's like 10 phone books stacked up, right? And I don't think there's a lot of poetry necessarily in a lot of legislation that's passed today. But here you have the entirety of the Wilderness Act of 1964. And this opening passage, section 2A, is poetry. In order to assure that an increasing population, accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization, does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States and its possessions, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition, it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. For this purpose, there is hereby established a national wilderness preservation system to be composed of federally owned areas designed by Congress as wilderness areas. These shall be administered for the use and enjoyment of the American people in such manner as will leave them unimpaired for future use and enjoyment as wilderness, and so as to provide for the protection of these areas, the preservation of their wilderness character, and for the gathering and dissemination of information regarding their use and enjoyment as wilderness. And no federal lands shall be designated as wilderness areas except as provided by this act. So this recognition by Congress that we're rapidly becoming a human-dominated landscape, overly mechanized, we need to act. Pretty cool. So, quick overview. What makes wilderness wilderness? And for those of you interested, I'll ask you to turn to the top of page 2, because there's a few words here that basically drive all the management the federal government does in wilderness areas. This is in section 2C. A wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man. Who's heard the word untrammeled before? It's kind of an anachronistic one. I think a lot of people confuse it with untrampled, and that ain't it, right? A trammel is a form of net. So the idea of something being untrammeled is that it's free from restriction. It has freedom. So to trammel something, some synonyms would be to restrain, to constrain, to curb, to check. In contrast, wilderness is supposed to be basically left alone to do its own thing. Okay? That's one of the primary management objectives, is to not manage it. And that can be really hard to do sometimes because there's a lot of reasons you might want to meddle in the wilderness area. Another term, undeveloped. So this one's a little bit more intuitive. We don't want to have a bunch of infrastructure. You're not going to see like outhouses, and you're not going to see developed campsites, and you shouldn't see roads at all, and you shouldn't see mechanized equipment being used. All of that compromises the idea of an area being undeveloped. Some exceptions might be, like for resource protection, if there's a popular stream crossing where the banks are getting hammered, you might see a bridge erected to try to protect the stream banks. Those kind of trade-offs are the management decisions that the federal agencies often face. Continuing on in this section, the area should be protected and managed to preserve its natural conditions. So naturalness, if you're a fish and wildlife junkie like I am, this is where things are really cool and interesting, because the native biota of a given wilderness area are fundamental elements of its wilderness character. The wildlife of a given wilderness, assuming they evolved and belong in that landscape, they are part of the wilderness. They constitute the wilderness. So when it comes to efforts, for example, to restore populations of Mexican wolves down in the Gila country, there are benefits associated with that conservation work from a fish and wildlife conservation perspective, but also from a wilderness character perspective. Based on the language of the Wilderness Act, if we have self-sustaining populations of Mexican wolves in these wilderness areas, those wilderness areas are better wildernesses as a result. So the fish and wildlife are a critical element. And I want to point out, sticking with the Mexican wolf theme, this is a map of these different wolf management zones. The core wolf habitat is that Wolf Management Zone 1 that spans the Arizona-New Mexico border. I just want you to kind of take note, if your geography of the wilderness distribution in New Mexico is up to par, you'll note that like the core of that area from east to west is the Aldo Leopold Wilderness, the Gila Wilderness, the Blue Range Wilderness. Then on the Arizona side, the Blue Range Primitive Area. The Mazatzals on the Tano are that big chunk over there on the west. So here's a glimpse of what the wilderness distribution looks like. So not only are wildlife an element of wilderness, but for some of these conservation challenges that we as biologists face, wilderness gives us some of our strongest holdout places to do our conservation work. Large, intact blocks of suitable habitat that are not disrupted by human activity. And one of the most obvious examples of that would be grizzly bear conservation. You know, up in the northern Rockies, and this is very true, by the way, for Mexican wolves as well. So you can think grizzlies, you can think wolves, there are other examples. But the interaction of these species with human beings is bad news for the animals and for the people, right? Human-bear conflicts kill bears. Sometimes they kill people. Human-wolf conflicts kill a lot of wolves and kill a lot of cows, which makes a lot of people upset and does damage to their livelihood. So the idea of trying to conserve species like these in a patchwork of small chunks of habitat in the absence of these like keystone intact blocks that are our wilderness areas. The Gila is an example, over 550,000 acres of uninterrupted Mexican wolf habitat with a ton of elk. If not for that complex of wilderness areas, trying to bring this species back to a self-sustaining place would be, I don't know if impossible is too strong of a word, but darn near. And grizzly bear conservation is the same, especially in the lower 48. Some other examples. We do a lot of work in the Forest Service in this region, thinking about how our management actions influence the conservation of Mexican spotted owls. And over the course of the last few years, I've been working with a partner group on surveying spotted owls all over the region on national forest lands, all over Arizona and New Mexico. And a cool thing that's happened is that we, you know, when you're trying to do this in a statistically valid way, you basically distribute your sampling effort. I'm just going to turn this off because I think that's probably obnoxious. You're trying to distribute your sampling effort in a way that is statistically valid. So you need to just kind of scatter your sampling points somewhat randomly around the map. And that has resulted in our survey crews going in and looking for owls in places that have never been surveyed before, a lot of them in the remote backcountry in places like the Gila. And the cool thing is, how many of these places that we've never been to with the survey that are turning up loads of Mexican spotted owls? Like, it's rare to go into the Gila backcountry and do a survey and not have owls respond. And part of the reason for that is the habitat quality is great. Part of the reason for that is because the Gila is a place where we've got fire playing an important role in driving habitat quality. So we haven't had the disruption in fire regimes in portions of the Gila to the same extent that we have in many other places, where when we get these fires, we have very high severity, large-scale fires that basically nuke owl habitat. Don't get me wrong, there have been some huge fires in the Gila that have done that, but we've got a lot of places with a lot of owls protected because the ecosystem is functioning, with fire being a key part of that. Arguably a less charismatic, but I think super cool species. It's an example of a very rare endemic. This is a Gila hot springs snail. The only place these things live are in the geothermal hot springs in the Gila. The biggest threat to their conservation are people going and playing in the hot springs. So if you can manage the people not, crushing the snails, you have this species that exists nowhere else in the world, kind of safeguarded in these hot springs that are scattered around the Gila. Another example. I'll give somebody a copy of the San County Almanac if they can tell me what fish this is. Yvette Perot would get it. This is a spike dace. So it is another Gila species, another at-risk, rare, endemic. And what I want to point out about these aquatic species, when wildernesses have been passed historically, a lot of them have been designated in remote, rugged, hard-to-reach, high places where there isn't some other higher best use. So a lot of the wildernesses, if you want to look for a wilderness, you look up in elevation a lot of the time. There's certainly exceptions. What that's done here in the Southwest by preserving these high country places is that somewhat inadvertently we have conserved the cold water, headwater, tributaries for a whole host of rare endemic fish, including the spiked dace, including riparian habitat for species like the Chiricahua leopard frog. If we go farther north, habitat for the Rio Grande cutthroat trout. Some of the best cutthroat trout fishing you're going to find in New Mexico is going to be up in wilderness areas. And having those places managed in a way where our objectives as public servants is to preserve the ecological integrity, that's a good thing from the standpoint of conserving the species that reside there. The same is true for Gila trout, same is true for bighorn sheep. So I want folks to understand that this idea of naturalness, the native biota, the indigenous biota, is a core element. And on the flip side, if you have species showing up that don't belong in that area, like we've had issues with feral hogs on the Lincoln getting into those wilderness areas, as an example, the invasion by non-native species into a wilderness area compromises the quality of the wilderness character. Also from the language of the Act, outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined type of recreation. What the heck does that mean? Solitude makes sense, right? Like being able to get away from the masses, which is precious. But this primitive and unconfined type of recreation, basically what that means is trying to give people an opportunity to recreate without a bunch of rules. You're not being told where to go, camp here, don't camp there, do this, don't do that. They're trying to minimize the constraints on the way you experience the place. So, you know, it gives you a lot of freedom to enjoy the backcountry the way that you want to. So on the flip side, you know, a good way to exemplify what I'm talking about, like the Boundary Waters canoe area, so many people want to go there that they've had to implement a permitting process. So if you want to go, you have to get a permit to go into the Boundary Waters. So they're making sure you have an opportunity for solitude, but it comes at a cost by having this system that requires you to have a permit, that requires you to have an itinerary. They do have designated camping spots, camp here, don't camp there. So one of the cool things about New Mexico is our wilderness areas, by and large, like you can easily get away from people and easily get away from rules. So that's primitive and unconfined. And then at the end here it says, the areas may also contain ecological, geological, or other features of scientific, educational, scenic, or historic value. So a good example of that here in New Mexico would be some of the fossil resources that we have in some of our wildernesses, including newly designated wildernesses as of 2019, like the Bisti de Nazin wilderness. That's where both of these specimens came from. And I did think I wanted to be a paleontologist when I grew up for most of my childhood, so I'll go ahead and tell you on the left, that's an Ankylosaurus skull. And then on the right, that's the Bisti beast, right? You guys may have seen that at the Natural History Museum here. So those, we talk about the four kind of fundamental elements of wilderness character: untrammeled, undeveloped, opportunities for solitude, primitive and unconfined type of recreation, naturalness, and then some wildernesses have this other features of value. So it's like the 4+1. Okay. So I know we've got an audience here that generally is going to be like probably leaning towards friendly about hunting, but maybe there's some folks in here who are thinking, if you're trying to maintain wilderness free from human interference, and you're trying to maintain the indigenous biota of a wilderness, doesn't the action of like going in there and killing an animal and taking it out, doesn't that kind of fly in the face of these wilderness objectives? So I want to touch on that a little bit. And first of all, what I want to say is, without the involvement and leadership of the hunting and fishing community in pushing for the creation of wilderness from the beginning, I think it's unlikely that it would have gained the traction to ever be passed. You know, having folks like Leopold driving the conversation from the 1920s and writing these op-eds in Outdoor Life and other outlets, pleading for the designation of the Gila as an area that can contain a 2-week pack hunting trip. And the titles of the essays being things like A Plea for Wilderness Hunting Grounds. From the beginning, it was envisioned by the thought leaders as a place where people could go and experience this primitive form of recreation. Another point I'd like to make is I'm a firm believer in the idea that in our own genetic barcode, we have an element of wilderness that has the ability to immerse itself in these settings and be part of the wilderness as an active participant. The notion that human beings have been a part of the indigenous biota of these landscapes for millennia shouldn't be lost on anybody. Humans are part of the wilderness system and have been. And I'll leave it there. I'm going to move on. What about these guys? How does this align with wilderness, with naturalness, with a landscape being untrammeled? And these questions often come up around grazing and around mining. And the two-part answer is having grazing and mining occurring in wilderness does fly in the face of those 4+1 elements of wilderness character, and it's also totally in line with the Wilderness Act of 1964. So grazing and mining, I won't belabor it, but on pages 5 through 7, there are some exemptions, some special exceptions to the Wilderness Act for these activities to persist. And for any wilderness area where grazing has occurred prior to designation, those activities shall be grandfathered in. And it's super important for people to understand the Wilderness Act passed with massive support in the House and the Senate. And if it weren't for those concessions, those agreements, those acceptances, there's no way we would have gotten the Wilderness Act passed. So I hear from people a lot of times they have an experience in the wilderness where they bump into cows. They don't like seeing cows in the wilderness. But it's important to know the history of the legislation and understand that that is expressly authorized and grandfathered in through the Wilderness Act. Okay. I want to point to a couple resources for y'all if you're interested in knowing where to go to learn about wildernesses in your area. The first thing I will point to, and again, if you hit one of those sign-in sheets, I'll share these links with you, but wilderness.net is it is the clearinghouse for all 4 federal land management agencies for all things wilderness. This is where you can get all your maps, all your data, backgrounds on the legislative history. You can download the enabling legislation that created these wilderness areas, and you can create your own maps, whatever you want to do. Wilderness.net is where it's at. So this is a map I pulled up from wilderness.net showing the entire National Wilderness Preservation System, color-coded by agency. Green is Forest Service, yellow is BLM, pink and purple are Park Service and Fish and Wildlife. I guess park would be the orange, fish would be the purple. And so in 1964, the Act points to a small collection of areas that were already listed as wilderness or wild or canoe areas, and those were adopted into the Wilderness Preservation System. That was the start of the National Wilderness Preservation System. But that was only 9 million acres in 13 states, 54 areas, 1964. So in the years since 1964, Congress has continued designating new wilderness to the point where, as of today, we're up to 823 wilderness areas, 111 million plus acres in 45 states and Puerto Rico. And here in New Mexico, we have 39 wildernesses, almost 2 million acres. That equates to about 3% of the state designated as wilderness. And a handful of these were part of the 1964 passage of the Act. The Gila was part of that. The Pecos was part of that. There are a handful of others. And as of 2019, tip my hat over to the BLM, but the president recently signed into law the John Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act. This was back in March, so about 2 months ago. And not only did that renew Every Kid in the Park program, also reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is one of our most critical pieces of legislation for obtaining and conserving important public lands. But this law also designated more than 600 miles of wild and scenic river and more than 1.3 million acres of new wilderness. And if you do the math here, New Mexico pulled up like 300,000 of the 1.3 million. So in the whole country, we had about 24% of the new wilderness areas designated. And that was 14 different areas, all of them on BLM. So if you're like hot to trot, you've already visited all the wildernesses of New Mexico, it's old hat to you. You got 14 more places to check out now if you haven't been there. And these are places I haven't explored yet, but I'm looking forward to doing that. Another recent win on the wilderness front that I want to point to and give a real enthusiastic pat on the back, both to the New Mexico Wildlife Federation and also, we got Heinrich and Udall were instrumental in helping make this happen. I'll just leave it at that, okay? The Sabinoso Wilderness Area was established in 2009, I believe. It's about 16,000 acres. And this whole chunk of country, and you can see Las Vegas, New Mexico here, so we're due east of Las Vegas, was all landlocked. There was no access to get in there. And a foundation, the Wind Foundation, donated about $3 million to purchase a private property adjacent to the wilderness area, and then donated that to the federal government. And with a lot of encouragement from our two U.S. senators, Secretary Zinke decided to accept that donation. And so now for the first time, 10 years after the designation of this wilderness area, the public has access to get into Sabinoso. And it's spectacular scenery. And I'll add that after granting access to these 16,000 acres, we're still sitting at about 600,000 acres of public land in New Mexico that remains landlocked to public access. So a little theme I'll start hitting on here is the idea that it's great to love your public land and love your wilderness areas, but that ain't enough. You got to be active. You have to make people know that you care about being able to, for example, gain access to 600,000 acres. You need to make your voices heard, and the way you do that is by getting involved with our NGO community, by getting involved with our elected officials. So 600,000 acres of your public land in this state are still inaccessible. All right. How many of y'all use Google Earth for your outdoor scouting adventures? Handful of folks. So make sure you get the sign-in sheet. I'll hit you up with some KMZs. These are some examples of the kind of files I'm going to share with you. These are national forest layers, get you into wilderness areas, show you where those are. And again, one of the things I want to do as your employee, as a public servant, is make sure I get the best information in your hands so that you can see where all these great places are. I want to touch briefly on a couple of the challenges that I perceive in our day when it comes to managing wilderness area. I'm going to point to an example from my native state of Michigan, up in Isle Royal, and my map's kind of cut off at the top, but this is a wide, skinny island up in Lake Superior off the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and most of the island is wilderness. And for forever, there's been a predator-prey dynamic between wolves and moose on the island. And that relationship is starting to unravel. And the driver of that is climate change. So what's happening up there is that wolves historically have been able to reach the island during the winter when Lake Superior is frozen. And those wolves emigrating to Isle Royal have provided much needed genetic diversity and maintained a robust wolf population and kept the moose population in check. In the absence of the infusion of that genetic diversity on the island, the wolf numbers have started to crash, and the moose numbers have skyrocketed, and the moose have been eating themselves out of house and home. And so over a multi-year decision process, the Park Service recently decided to translocate some wolves from the mainland to bring them into the wilderness, which is a perfect example of trammeling. It's a perfect example of manipulating the wilderness through human influence. And it wasn't a decision that was taken lightly. But this points to a broader challenge when it comes to managing all our public lands, certainly including wilderness, which is how do we in the era of climate change try to maintain places that are free from human interference? So you have to think about the fact that in 1964, when the Wilderness Act was passed, these thought leaders were operating under the assumption that you could establish a 1,000,000 acre or a 2,000,000 acre chunk of ground or a 500,000 acre chunk of ground in the Gila and set it aside and have it be free from human interference. But now we know there's no place on the globe today that is exempted from the impacts of our activities, the burning of fossil fuel and the changing climate being a perfect example of that. So how do we reconcile our desire to maintain a place in its wild, untrammeled condition with the potential degradation of its wildness as a result of our indirect influences? And Isle Royale is a good example of that. But I think maybe the even bigger existential threat facing wilderness, but also all of our shared wild places, public lands, is the growing disconnect between our citizenry and the natural world. You know, the rates of urbanization have steadily climbed. We're now to the point where the strong majority of human beings on the planet live in an urban or suburban setting. That's certainly true in the United States now as well. And so the average person doesn't have the opportunity to go out and camp by the stream, free from adult contribution or interference, and catch brook trout, and, you know, build campfires and do all the things that made my childhood awesome. You know, the average person simply does not have access to those opportunities anymore. So how do we retain a critical mass of people who care about wild spaces as we continue to urbanize? And so a couple thoughts on that front. One is, I think all of us need to continue being champions for remote wild places. And I think like that's like the major leagues, man. Like backpacking through the Gila, doing a thru hike in the Pecos, that's some advanced outdoor activity. And if you like doing that, more power to you. But you are a tiny minority of the voting public, of the consuming public. And if we're going to make a dent as a community of people who care about conservation, we have to figure out how we can reach people who are never going to go backpacking in the Gila, who are never going to go backpacking in the Pecos, who are never going to go explore the 14 new wilderness areas. There's a couple ways to do that. One is we should all be advocating for as much access to green space for as many people as possible, with our minds towards communities that are underprivileged. The green space access for those folks is going to be, by the simple laws of supply and demand, that much more precious. So if you're a wilderness champion, I would encourage you to think of yourself as a green space champion for your fellow human beings, regardless of whether or not they care about wilderness. Another point I want to make, this is one of my favorite pictures of Teddy and John Muir in Yosemite. This was taken in 1906. The reason I like this picture is because you have the founding father of the Sierra Club standing there with the founding father of the Boone and Crockett Club, right? And what's happened in the 113 years since this picture was taken is the conservation enterprise has splintered and specialized. You've got clubs and organizations for every species and every place, and, you know, do you belong to this group or that group? And, you know, if I hunt, what do the people at the Wilderness Society think of me? Like, everybody's kind of differentiated to an absurd degree. Even within the hunting community, are you a bow hunter or are you a gun hunter? If you're a bow hunter, do you shoot with a traditional bow or a modern bow? If you shoot with a traditional bow, are you a recurve or a long bow? Did you build your bow or did you buy your? It's like, what the hell are you talking about, man? We all love the same stuff. So if we could find a way to collectively revert to our conservation roots and actually build a coalition of people simply who care about the quality of life that we all experience, because that's what we're ultimately talking about, is like the suitability of human habitat. The suitability of human habitat. Do we want to be in a world where the air is clean, the water is clean? Because you don't have to go to wilderness, especially in a place like the dry Southwest, to be a beneficiary of the clean water that's flowing from the headwaters in the Pecos or up in the Sangres in southern Colorado. It matters to you whether you go there or not. Your life actually depends on it. So building that coalition, we need to figure that out. All right. Now, in closure, what I want to do is I want to tell you about my commute this morning. You all have been a very great, patient audience. I appreciate the time with you. But this morning I was driving in, listening to the BBC. I have a 20-minute commute. There were 3 stories that were on. I was thinking about this talk, and these 3 stories might not seem linked to you. Let me tell you what they were. The first one was a doctor from the UK presenting on how human beings during the Industrial Revolution, we changed our habitat and our lifestyle in a dramatic way, right? We got automobiles, got factories, we started commuting. You know, you fast forward to today. As a wildlife biologist, I sent like 100 emails today, sitting in a cubicle, right? Like, that's the norm. And so we changed our habitat, and now our habitat is changing us. What he was presenting on is that now human beings today, just as a result of 200 years post-industrial revolution, our feet are bigger, flatter, and more fragile than our ancestors. And this has serious repercussions. This doctor was talking about being contracted by the UK government military because so many of their new recruits, their feet just like fall apart during basic training because they're not getting used enough because everybody's sitting on their keisters all the time. So this gentleman was presenting like fossils of our ancient ancestors who had these small, curvy, hard feet, and then contrasting them to like the big, flat, glass feet of modern man. And so I was thinking, it's interesting that a species could change its habitat and then over the course of like 2 centuries start suffering the ill effects of its own habitat modification. So that was the first story. And that one's like relatively lighthearted. It's about to get a little darker here. I'm going to warn you. The second story, it was announced air quality, or better stated, compromised air quality, has now surpassed smoking as a killer of human beings, to the tune of 8.8 million deaths estimated per year as a result of air quality. So I'm hearing that and thinking, okay, obviously having these expanses of wild country adjacent to a place like Albuquerque, anybody who understands, you know, what trees do, there's benefit to air quality. All right, so that's like a pretty easy sell. And then the next one, and like this isn't a good one for small ears, but the next story, and you guys might hear about this one as well. I heard a story about a 16-year-old Malaysian girl who got on Instagram and sent out a poll to all of her Instagram followers and asked them to vote on whether or not she should take her own life on Instagram. 70% said you should do it. And guess what? She jumped to her death. This is a news story you'll probably hear. I heard it this morning on my way in. And, you know, it's like the latest in an example of how there are all these unintended consequences associated with this drug that all of us are addicted to. And I'm not sitting here telling you I'm any better than the rest of you. I'm picking up that phone nonstop. But I was thinking about that story and thinking about what a compromised state of self-confidence and community and personal empowerment that a 16-year-old girl would have to feel in order to do something like that. And I was thinking about how the things that we had experienced for the last week in a place, by the way, where the phones literally do not work, and it's one of my favorite things about being down there. But I don't think it's too much of a sell to say that in some like really fundamental, important ways, having access to these places creates the kind of relationships and the kind of self-identity and the kind of confidence and empowerment that equips a person to grow up in a way where something like that just is not on the table. And so whether you're talking about having feet that aren't made of glass, or whether you're talking about, not dying from horrible air, or whether you're talking about having the people in your life forming meaningful, tight bonds with one another, I believe there's a very real, very significant place for these wilderness areas in our lives today. And along those lines, last thing I want to show you is this video. My daughter helping me roost some gobblers down in the Gila. You're probably not going to get audio, but you'll see her working that slate. And I'll just raise my hand when the bird gobbles at her. So with that, thank you all, and I'll gladly take questions. Good on time? Thanks, gang. Appreciate it. And I'd love to answer any questions y'all have. I'll hang around. And yes, sir. So I work for all of you. I'm an employee of the U.S. Forest Service. I work here in the regional office, which is located in downtown Albuquerque on Broadway, between Central and Lead. Yep.
Maps.
Yep. Sir.
I work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife up in Alaska.
Nice.
And was a lead out investigator on the exxon case.
Wow.
What was your PhD in, and what was your focus on your thesis?
So, yeah, the question, what was the focus of my thesis? For my PhD, I worked in the nature reserve system of Southwest China and looked at how that approach to conservation of establishing these designated wildlife areas focused on the giant panda actually conserved a whole rich array of other large mammals under the umbrella of the panda. So it's focused on the government's approach to conservation in China, and it was through that work I started reflecting back on all the things I'd taken for granted with America's public land system, right? The fact that you don't need a permit to go there. The fact you can go and hunt and camp and fish and do all the immersion without asking for somebody's permission. And that was where the spark really started to light for me around the idea of public service here in America with our Forest Service.
So as a follow-up, if I may, I'll
Sure.
You mentioned the Wilderness Act. Of course, I think I can speak for most of us in here that to say we're not thrilled to see talent all over the wilderness area. This is not allowed.
Yep.
So is there any possibility to do amendments within the Wilderness Act to prohibit cattle grazing in the wilderness area?
Well, so I think the important thing to bear in mind there is the folks who had been grazing livestock historically up to the designation of a wilderness, those are the ones being grandfathered in. If you have a wilderness that hadn't historically had grazing, no new grazing is going to be authorized. And if you have somebody who's been grazing in a place and then a wilderness is designated, you're talking about prohibiting that activity. You're talking about taking something really fundamental and valuable away from somebody who's been a participant in that landscape for a long time. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that we've got, all of our grazing issues figured out. We've got plenty of challenges to face. But the reason the Wilderness Act gained the support it did is because it accommodated those uses that had been ongoing historically. The language around mining was more aggressive in terms of eliminating it over time. There was a sunset date in 1984. It was December 31st, 1984. Beyond that date, no new claims could be filed in wilderness. And this, the same is true. Like, no new grazing is going to happen in wilderness. But, I think it would be the kind of thing that would appropriately raise people's hackles if you had the government trying to take that access, that privilege away that they've enjoyed historically. Now, that being said, in places where we have conflicts, the idea of retiring some of these permits, like there's been issues with some of the allotments on the Gila, where there have been a lot of conflicts between the grazing community and wolves. And some of the NGOs have been exploring the idea of trying to buy out and retire permits. And even that can be really sensitive politically, because the folks that are vested in that community don't want to see those that access for grazing taken away. And if I put myself in their shoes, I totally get it. And I too have had those experiences of being in the backcountry and bumping into cows, and you feel like the wilderness experience is being compromised. But that's why it's so important to understand it was that compromise leading up to the passage of the act that got it over the hump. And in the absence of that, I don't think we'd have a Wilderness Act to talk about. So Tony, and then I'll come to you.
What's the wilderness consciousness in China?
Man, it is. So what's the wilderness consciousness in China? It is like the most foreign thing culturally. When I finished my undergrad education, I went to Alaska, and I had the goal of catching all the Pacific salmon species on my fly rod and backpacking around. I had like $500 to my name. And while I was up there, I went to this stream just south of Talkeetna and hiked way up it. And I fished in there for a week, and I did not see another person. When I came out at the end of the week, and maybe some of you have experienced this, I got picked up hitchhiking, and I was trying to talk. It was like my talking skills were rusty because I hadn't used them in so long. And I told that story. I've got a lot of just dear, dear friends in China. And I've told that story to them about going for a week and not seeing any people and catching all these fish and what a great adventure. And they just think it's the most ridiculous, unappealing, absurd thing that you can imagine. So again, I think it's really ethnocentric. Like the whole wilderness idea, it doesn't resonate with all cultures all around the world. But here in America, I'm really thankful there's a substantial proportion of people who seem to share the values I have around it. But it does not translate in China at all from my experience. You.
I'm going to ask you a hard question, because this is kind of a big debate in New Mexico right now, and it has to do with trapping.
Okay.
There's a big divide in New Mexico, and it's kind of lopsided. You have a big group of people that are against trapping, and a small group of people that are actual trappers. I know there's been proposed bans on banning trapping in the whole on forest lands. A lot of arguments are negative effects on wildlife, people's dogs getting caught in traps, and so forth. What is your view on trapping, on either having a positive, negative effect? As you study the wilderness, do you see, I guess, a way the two sides can agree and still pursue, I guess, what they like to do without interfering with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I could see the issue from both sides 100%. I think it's important for people on the anti-trapping side of the conversation to understand from a wildlife management perspective, a wildlife research perspective, there are a lot of reasons why having the ability to manage fur bearers through trapping has scientific and resource benefits. There's like some of the really easy examples would be places where you're trying to conserve sea turtles and you have them getting hammered by foxes on the beach. Being able to go in there and implement a trapping program. Recreational trapping is a stickier wicket, I think, than some of the science-based and really directly management-based activities. But from a federal perspective, it's important to understand those activities are administered by the state Fish and Game Agency. They are not out of alignment with the Wilderness Act. There's certainly nothing in the Wilderness Act that prohibits those activities. They're right there with hunting. And another point, bear with me. Man, I had another point I wanted to throw out there. Yes, that's exactly right. Thank you. Dude, you're right there with me. We've talked about this a lot. This is Brian Dykstra. He just retired as our wildlife program leader. Great colleague. So what's interesting about this topic, the Wilderness Act, among the things in Section 4C of prohibited uses is commercial activity. And so depending on what someone plans on doing with the parts of an animal that they hunt or trap in wilderness, it may be considered commercial activity. And the BLM actually issued some wilderness management guidelines that prohibit trapping if the trapper intends to sell the fur prohibiting as a commercial use. And I can tell you, like, there's a lot of tension around wildlife management in wilderness because it can oftentimes kind of put a fine point on the conflict between state and federal jurisdiction around the management of wildlife. And that passage of the language by the BLM was not welcomed by the state game and fish community. So it's complex. You're right, it's very controversial. I think it's important for people to realize there are some reasons from a wildlife management standpoint that trapping has some really valuable legitimacy. But I can also understand the concerns on the other side of it. I'll just leave it at that. It's a good question. Others?
We have about 10 more minutes for questions.
So, obviously, the pit and Robinson tax is a big thing that contributes to conservation efforts from hunters and fishermen. What other kind of taxes?
And trappers.
And trappers. So, what other kind of taxes should we look out for that you think might have good potential for things like a backpack tax or other kinds of people that enjoy the natural outdoors that we should look out for and maybe push for to help continue the contribution?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as a federal employee, I kind of have to like watch myself in terms of pushing for particular legislation. But I do think we've got some really awesome examples to look to. Okay, and so for folks who aren't totally up to speed on the topic here, much of the conservation work, particularly done at the state game and fish agency level, like the kind of traditional model, is that licensed buyers are paying a huge amount of money to support the conservation work of the state agency. And they're doing that in two ways. Not only are they buying the license, but they're also buying equipment, and that equipment has an excise tax on it. So things like guns, ammunition, archery equipment, fishing tackle, etc., gas for boats. All that's taxed at an 11% rate, and that helps fill the coffers of the state game and fish agency. And one of the problems is that participation, particularly in hunting and trapping, less so in fishing, is declining. So there's a smaller pool of people buying licenses, and budgets for state fish and wildlife, Department of Natural Resources, game and fish agencies are declining. So how do you fill that gap? Right now, there's been a push for a big nationwide tax on oil and gas development, having essentially an excise tax on oil go towards helping support the state agencies. But we have several states that have a statewide sales tax in place. So Missouri is an example, Minnesota is an example, and in those states you have a small percentage sales tax that's resulting in those state agencies being funded at a much higher level. And I think given that the mission of these state agencies is really to serve all citizens of the state, it makes sense that all citizens of the state would have a way to pay into that. And that being said, the idea of a backpack tax, so excise taxes on other things, whether it's backpacks, binoculars, things that other outdoor recreationists are using, I don't think it's an either-or approach. I think if we have the community of conservation folks pushing for additional funding to do good things for fish and wildlife, I'm not opposed to any of it.
Clean water, clean air.
Clean water and clean air, man. The language I like to use is like human prosperity. We're in the business of human prosperity. These are the things that make all of our lives better. Outdoor recreation, clean water, clean air, fish and wildlife. If you're taking care of that stuff, life is better. I like to jog a little bit, like try to stay fit. And I was in China, my first trip over there, and I go jogging. I'm in Beijing, got my shorts on, my t-shirt. Everybody's looking at me like, who's this tall foreigner going down the sidewalk? And then it starts raining, and people start looking at me real crazy then, and like giving me all these looks. And this guy finally grabs me, and he's trying to talk to me. I don't know what he's saying, and then he's like pointing to his eyes. It's about that time, like the rain is starting to get my eyes, and it's burning my eyes because the rain is so acidic from the pollution. So you can't, like, at that point, it's not about, like, did you get an elk tag this year? It's like, is life worth living? It's fundamental quality of life. So, yes, human prosperity, man. Can we rally around that? That's what I'd like to do. Yeah.
Guys, we've got a couple more minutes. Let's just do at least two or three more questions.
Not with wilderness, the
Yeah, this was a big controversy. So state land office, yeah, you know, trying to, I mean, okay, so what's the mission of the state land office? It's to try to maximize the amount of money that they generate to pay into, I think it's the public school system, right? The revenue from state land office goes to support the public school system. So if I'm the commissioner of public lands for the state of New Mexico, and you know, we're not like exactly crushing it on the education front, I'm going to do everything I can to try to leverage that resource for as much money as I can to try to do good things for education. And I'm saying, speaking personally right now, whether it's an increased amount of money that I'm asked to pay in for access to state land, and that's going to go to support education, or whether the Game and Fish proposes a license fee increase, so my $34 deer tag costs me $40. Bring it on, man. I want to pay more. Like, these are the things that, again, like, make society better. I think a lot of the problems that we have right now here in Albuquerque in New Mexico, a lot of that stems from insufficient support for our educational system. So I'm not opposed to the idea of spending some more money on that.
You want a sticky wicket?
Bring a sticky wicket, Radijay.
Okay. And it pertains to wilderness.
And you had your hand up back there. What do you guys do? I'll come to you.
I think this is a really good crowd for talking about bighorn sheep management in wilderness, because there's a sticky issue about capturing and moving and doing all that stuff in wilderness with bighorn sheep management.
Yeah.
Explain the issues in case they see it, like in the newspapers or coming up here. What is the big issue with bighorn sheep management in wilderness?
Okay, so bighorn sheep in wilderness, you know, a lot of the management activity, and first of all, in this region, both Arizona Game and Fish and the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish have done phenomenal work bringing desert and Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep back to robust populations in a lot of places, and it's a phenomenal conservation story. One of the challenges is that a lot of the bighorn habitat overlaps designated wilderness, and one of the key tools that the states use to manage bighorn sheep populations are helicopters. Being able to move bighorns around the landscape, being able to fly in and capture bighorns to do things like monitor them for pneumonia. And the landing of aircraft in wilderness, by and large, with some exceptions, is expressly prohibited, again, in Section 4C of the Wilderness Act. So when Game and Fish in any state wants to land a helicopter in wilderness, they need to have an authorization from the federal government to do that. And again, that puts a fine point on this conflict of state versus federal jurisdiction around wildlife management in wilderness. And so the sticky wicket here is that in order to justify the use of prohibited means for any bighorn sheep management activity, it has to be determined that that's the minimum tool required to achieve an action that has a benefit to wilderness. And so, for example, let's say you've got a particular wilderness area that has twice the number of bighorn sheep that Game and Fish would like to have in there. And what Game and Fish would really like to do is move some of those bighorn sheep to another wilderness area and establish a new population, which makes perfect sense from a wildlife management standpoint. The question would be, is the minimum tool to reduce the bighorn sheep in that first wilderness area a helicopter? Or can anybody think of an easier way, without violating the Wilderness Act, to remove some bighorn sheep from that wilderness area? Hunting, mountain lions, yeah, I mean the list goes on, right? So that, in a nutshell, is the controversy. And in fact, just a couple nights ago, Arizona Game and Fish had a webcast, live webcast. They did a good job where they were laying out some of the issues around a proposed helicopter use project on several different wildernesses of the Tonto, and they were fielding exactly questions like that. So it's a sticky one, and there's a lot of case law, and it's murky, but you have to be able to say it's the minimum tool, and there's some benefit to wilderness.